Hi everyone. Welcome to today's office hour. Just thought to point out before we start out with what we have to discuss today. Hi everyone. Welcome to just before we're going to what we have to discuss today. Just thought to mention that you should all be patient with your submissions, in that they will all be graded eventually. So don't worry about your task not being graded yet. I'm going to get to all submissions eventually, so please be patient. Today we're just going to, I did mention in our last office hour that we're going to go through the DART cheat sheet, but I felt it's important to cover some of the items we have in week 2's resources, that is the basics, right? So we're going to cover the basics, like, when I mean the basics, I'm talking from the main function to declaring variables to different data types to control flow and if statements. We'll see how much we can cover with our limited time. So yeah, that's the goal for today. I'm going to share my screen now and we'll get started. I did check the sheet and no new questions were asked, so I guess that's it for that. Yeah, let me share my screen and we'll get started with that. Okay, so hoping you all can see my screen. Let us change it to lesson. Okay, so this is Dartpad, right? A lot of you should be familiar with Dartpad already. Ideally, when you create a new pad, when you open that pad, you should see the sample code. So I'm just going to clean up everything and then we'll get started from the jump. Okay. So the starting point of every Dart code or every Flutter code is this function right here. Without the main function is pretty much the most important point in your code, because every single thing that you run starts from here. Even if you have a bunch of other sample functions and so on and so forth, as many as you might have, all the other functions that you have available. Sorry, let me rename that. Oops. So you could have as many functions as there can be, right? And inside of all of them, say you have different print statements. Here you have two. Oops. Oh. Okay, so we start from 1, here we have 2, here we have 3. Even though I have print statements in all of these functions, if I click run, nothing is going to be displayed in the console because all these functions were called or were written outside of our main function. The main function has nothing going on, hence why our console is blank. But if I were to call one of these functions, for example, inside of our main method and run, then would see what is expected to be printed in the console. So this is the starting point of all your Dart or Flutter code. So ensure that whenever you get started, in the point where you have to probably write code from scratch, you do not ever miss this method because it's going to be needed. I think if I'm to run this without a main method, there should be an error in the console. It says no main method found. So this is very important in your Dart or Flutter code, right? So we've covered the importance of our main method. Now we also slightly covered one other inbuilt method in Dart, which is the print statement, right? Which helps us to print pretty much, which helps us to display pretty much anything we want in the console, right? So it starts with the word print followed by 2 parentheses. Then whatever we want printed in the console is added in between the parentheses, and then it ends with a semicolon. So we could display pretty much anything at all we want in our console. Okay, let's print something that actually makes sense. So we have this string hello world printed in the console. We could also print numbers, right? We could print pretty much anything at all in our console using this print statement. Anything at all that we want, we can display in the console with this. So it's important when you're debugging, say for example, like the task that was given for week 2, where you're expected to display odd numbers only or to display a certain string. This can be used to figure out what exactly is going on with our code. It's possible we have a bunch of things that we've written and we want to make sure that the value that we expect from our code is what is going to be presented to the user. We can debug, that is to, we can debug using this print statement to figure out exactly if, say for example, your code isn't working as you want it to, you can find out the point where your code where your code, where the problem is, right? You can figure out where the problem is using the print statements, okay? So it's pretty important for debugging or for just plainly checking if our code is acting the way we expect it to act, right? Now, another thing that would also cover is variables. What are variables? Very basically, a variable is a container. In very simple terms, a variable is a container. What do we mean? A container is pretty much anything that can hold an item or items, right? We call a variable a container because it holds values, right? It can hold a value or it can hold different values inside of it. For example, say we were to declare a variable. Okay, before we go into declaring variables, but before we go into the examples, you should note that there are different ways in which we can declare variables. You can either use the keyword var, or you could use dynamic, or you could use final, or you could use const, or you could use a data type, right? Oops. For example, string, ints, double, map, set, list, whichever etc. Whichever way in which you decide to, in whichever way you choose to declare your variable, whichever data type fits your use case, then you can declare a variable with it. But there's numerous options in which you can take advantage of when declaring a variable. The difference between all of these, let's look at all of them in action, right? Say for example, you declare a variable using var, say name, Abby. This is valid code, right? The Dart compiler understands that this variable here is a string because you have assigned it a value of a string. If I were to change this to age and give it a value of 50, the compiler knows that the value assigned to this variable is an int. Okay. Okay, I'll go into the difference much later. Another way in which we can declare a variable is using dynamic, right? I personally would advise that you use this less because a dynamic variable can sometimes make your code not function in the way that you expect it to. It can lead to unexpected problems that could potentially break your code. For example, you have a variable, you assign it a value of a string, just like we did for var before. The compiler at this point doesn't know, it has no, like when a variable is declared as dynamic, whatever you assign to it is pretty much undefined. It's always going to be a dynamic variable. Now, that's the major difference between using var or using dynamic, right? With a dynamic, your variable is always going to be dynamic. But with var, whatever value you use to initialize your variable, this age variable is always going to be identified as an integer at any point in your code. So you could another thing to note is you can also assign new values to variables declared with var or dynamic. What I mean is you could come here and reassign the value of 25 to age, and it's fine. If I print age here, we expect that in the console, what's displayed is the new variable that was assigned to age, which is 25. So when our code is being compiled, it starts from the top to the bottom. Yes, when we first initialized the variable age, we assigned it the value of 20. If I were to comment this and print the value of age, we're going to get 50, right? Because that's the value that we assigned to it. But while going down our code, the compiler is going to see that, oh, here we reassigned, we gave the age variable a new value, which is 25. So this becomes the updated value of age. Hence, when we run it, we get to see 25 in the console. Now, note that I said it's always going to be known at any point in your code that age is an integer. So if I were to come here and assign this a string, we're going to get an error that a value of type string can be assigned to a variable of type int. Hence, this code is always going to throw an error. Like, we're not going to be able to successfully run the code because we have an error in our code, right? So it's always going to be, at any point where you reassign a value, reassign a value, it's always going to be an integer. In this case, when the variable is declared with a var. But for dynamic, I could come here and assign the name variable. I could assign it, excuse me, 4.2. And there is not going to be an error. If I print name, we'll be getting 4.2 as a value of, as the value for name. So even though we assigned it a string at the beginning, we can go ahead to assign it pretty much any other thing. Even, we could even come here and assign it a list of numbers, right? And it's going to be fine. We're not going to have any error in the console because the variable was declared with a dynamic. So this can be a problem in your code if, say, for example, you need this variable for something else, right? Say we have a variable number, and initially here we assigned it a value of 5. And later on in our code, we wanted to, for some reason, use this variable to calculate, to perform some mathematical operation, right? Say we wanted to, we created a new variable, say multiply number by x, for example. So we have a random number of 100, and we want to multiply it by the value of number. Okay, if I were to print this in the console and run our code, we're expecting to see 500. But if before I declare this variable, I come here and I reassign and I assign the number variable a string of 20. And then I try to run the code, we expect to see an error because 20 is not a subtype of num, which simply means that 20 is not a number and we cannot use it for a mathematical operation, right? So that's the primary disadvantage of declaring our variables with dynamic, because anything can go wrong from the moment you declare the variable to the endpoint of our code, right? So it's, if possible, it's best to avoid declaring variables using dynamic. Okay, so that's the example, that's the deal with declaring variables with var or dynamic. Then we have we have final. You could also declare your variable using final. I'm just going to use the examples that we used before. So we have a variable that we assign it a value of 50. So with variables declared as final, note that, okay, note if you remember with var and dynamic, we could reassign values to our variables. But the difference with a final is after you have declared a final variable, you cannot reassign it. You can only set the value of final variable once. So this would not fly, right? Now, that's one primary difference. Then it's also, just as we have for var, whatever value you assign to a final variable is always going to be known. So you've assigned it an int, is always going to be an int. If you change this and you assign it a string, it's always going to be a string at any point that you run your code, right? Now, there is another way in which you can declare variables, and that's with a const. So any variable that is declared with a const is best known to our compiler as being a constant. You know what a constant is? Just like how we have the value of pi. The value of pi is always going to be the value of pi at like pretty much any part of the world, right? The value of pi is always going to be the same way. So that's pretty much the same as when you declare a variable with const. So say you have present year equals 2022, right? At any point of your code where you like this value is pretty much frozen. You know, it's pretty much at the yeah, it's pretty much frozen, right? And it's going to stand as being a constant in your code base, in your code. And one thing about constant variables is you have to assign them a value at the point where they are being at the point where you initialize it, right? So we have an error here that says the constant present year must be initialized. So const variables are expected to be initialized, to be assigned a value at the point where you create the variable. So you can't just, I mean, with a final, you can do that. You can easily just declare the final variable without giving it a value, but with a const, there should always be a value assigned to a const variable. So you could use this, you could, an example of a case where you could use a const keyword is maybe, say you have certain strings in your code that are reusable, or you have colors that you get to reuse in most parts of your code. So you just declare them in some file in your code base and just keep reusing them at any point because they are always going to be the same at any point where you use them within your code base. Okay. So that's like the primary difference between the final and the const. So yeah, that's the primary difference between the final and the const. Then another way in which you can declare a variable is using data types. So we have an example of data types here. You could either declare, declare with a data type means you do not get to leave the compiler to get to figure out what kind of variable we're dealing with, just as we have with the final, for example, where we're assigning it a value of 50. We didn't give it any data type, but it already knows that it's an int. But we could go ahead to just do that plainly by assigning it an int already from the variable creation or initialization rather, and assign it the value of 50. So this way, we know that age is always going to be an integer. If I go ahead to reassign a value that is not an int to this variable, that is going to scream at us because you cannot assign a double to an int, right? So at any point in your code, oh yeah, that's also something to note. You can reassign values to variables declared with data types, just as you can with var or dynamic. You can do that when you declare a variable with a data type. But the thing is, it must always be the data type that you assign to your variable at any point in your code. We assign this a value of an int, which is 50. So integers are plain numbers. not numbers with decimals or whatever. It has to be a plain number, right? So assigning it a decimal value, which is a double, which is known as doubles, which are known as doubles in that's numbers with decimal points. You can't assign this to an integer. In this case, you would have to create a double, say height, and give it a value of say 180.2. So, sorry. So this is acceptable as a variable. I could go ahead and we assign it with a value of 5.5, and there's not going to be a problem because this is a double, which is the same with age. If I come here and we assign it a value of 25, there's not going to be a problem because 25 is an integer. Another example is a string. Oops, sorry. You have to always give it a name. So you could also assign this a value of string. And if I come here and I assign it a value of 2, there's going to be an error because you can't assign a value of type int to a variable that has been declared as a string. So this is pretty much it about variables in Dart, how you can, different ways that are available to us in which we can declare variables. Yeah, the other types of variables on your own, please try to play around with it. That's also another thing. We would definitely not cover we would definitely not cover every single thing that exists or every single part of the resources that are going to be shared to you. So we expect that you take your own time and you go through each resource, each link or the resources that are going to be shared weekly or that have been shared weekly because they've already been shared, and you on your own practice. Okay, we've mostly talked about doubles, integers, strings. Let's just take, we also did cover lists. You could have a list of names, right? One thing with lists is this is going to be a dynamic list because we have not assigned it a data type. It's just like the dynamic, it's just like the dynamic variable. If you do not assign a data type to a list, then it's going to pretty much accept anything inside of it. Say I initially do this. I think it's possible to come here and assign it numbers. And there won't be, and that won't scream at me because it's a dynamic list, right? It wasn't stated that this is a list of strings, or this is a list of integers, or this is a list of doubles. It's just a dynamic list, as you can see here in the But if I were to change this to being a list of ints, I expect that there should now be an error because our compiler knows now that this is a list of ints and we cannot be assigning it a value. We cannot be assigning it a string when we have declared the variable as a list of ints. To correct that, we'll change it to a list of string, and now this is going to throw an error because it is the type int can be assigned to a list type of string. So if I were to easily change this, our error should go away because now we have successfully assigned it a string, which kind of satisfies what is expected of this, right? Which is a list of strings. So when declaring a list is also great if you can add a data type. If you're aware of the data type that's required for your list, it's best that you add a data type to it, just in case your variable might need to be reassigned much later in your code. So this is an example of a list. We also have a map. What example can we use as a map? Let's use noun. So maps are declared using curly brackets. You know, with lists, we have square brackets. Whenever you see a square bracket, you know that the variable type is most likely a list. When you see curly brackets, you know that the data type is most likely a map. So this is also going to be a dynamic map because we haven't assigned it a data type. So maps are different in that they deal with key value pairs. What do we mean? So in a map, you need to assign a key. We need to give it a key and then assign it a value, right? So this is a key. A key is pretty much the identifier for this value. So if I were to, yeah, this is pretty much an identifier for this value. So you have a key here. You assign it a value using a colon. Then after the colon, you then give it a value. You could also add more items into a map. You could add as many items that you want inside of a map, right? And we already covered how to access items in a list, but let's just do it one more time. So lists, values in a